She stood on a wooden platform in the middle of Red Hollow, while men laughed and placed bets on whether anyone would take her at all. 3 little girls clutched her skirt. The auctioneer called her used goods. The crowd agreed. But one man stepped forward, not because he pitied her, not because he was kind, but because something in the way she refused to lower her eyes told him she was the most dangerous thing in that town. And he was right. What happened next would bring down the most powerful man in the county, burn old loyalties to the ground, and prove that the woman everyone dismissed as worthless was the one person none of them could afford to ignore. If you're watching this story from wherever you are in the world, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The auction started at 10 in the morning, and by 1:30, most of the serious business was already done. Red Hollow held its labor auctions twice a year, once in spring before the planting, and once in early fall before the cold came down hard from the mountains. It was a practical arrangement, or so the town told itself. Families in need of work offered their time and their hands in exchange for wages, room, and board. The wealthier ranchers and merchants came to bid, and the transaction was dressed up in the language of commerce so that nobody had to say plainly what it was. Most people didn't linger on what it was. The square in front of Harwick's general store served as the auction ground. There were maybe 60 people gathered that morning, not all of them bidders. Some had just come to watch, the way people in small places always come to watch anything that breaks the routine. Children ran along the edges of the crowd. A pair of men near the back shared a flask and kept a running commentary on everything they saw. The auctioneer, a round man named Cecil Potts, who wore the same brown coat every year and sweated through it regardless of season, worked through his list with efficient cheerfulness. Strong young men went quickly and for good prices. Women with specific skills, seamstresses, cooks experienced with large households, drew respectable offers. The whole thing moved at a brisk pace for the first 2 hours. Then Cecil Potts called the name Mabel Harlow. She came up the 3 steps to the platform the way a person walks into a room where they know they're not welcome. Not shuffling, not shrinking, but with a kind of rigid control that looked from a distance like calm, and from up close was something else entirely. She was 34 years old, though she looked older that morning, and she wore a dress that had been good once and had since been mended so many times that the patches had patches. Her hair was pinned back with whatever she'd had. Her boots didn't match in color, one brown and one closer to black, though at a distance you wouldn't notice unless you were looking. Behind her on the steps came her daughters. The oldest was 11, Clara, with her mother's same set jaw and her father's reddish hair. The middle one was 8, named June, and she held Clara's hand in both of hers and kept her eyes on her mother's back like she was navigating by it. The youngest, Ada, was 5, and she was too young to understand the situation, but old enough to understand that something was wrong, so she had pressed herself so tightly against her mother's side that they moved like one creature up the stairs. Mabel reached the platform and stood where Cecil Potts pointed and looked out at the crowd. It took about 4 seconds for someone to laugh. It wasn't a single person. It was that kind of laughter that passes through a crowd like a cough, one person catching it from the next, until it became general enough that nobody was responsible for starting it. What they were laughing at was the whole picture of her: the mismatched boots, the over-mended dress, the 3 children, and the fact that everyone in Red Hollow already knew the story of Mabel Harlow and found it instructive. Her husband, Thomas Harlow, had died 14 months ago. He'd been a decent enough man in his way. Not ambitious, not particularly skilled at farming, but decent. And he'd left behind a homestead with more debt attached to it than actual value, 2 seasons of failed crops, and no arrangement of any kind for his family's future. The bank had moved on the property inside of 3 months. Mabel had spent the time since then doing whatever work she could find in town, washing, mending, helping in the kitchen at the hotel, and it hadn't been enough. And everyone knew it hadn't been enough, and the fact that she'd lasted 14 months before showing up at a labor auction was something nobody gave her credit for. "Mabel Harlow," Cecil Potts announced, and his voice took on that particular careful neutrality of a man trying not to editorialize. Age 34, former homesteader. Skills include cooking, mending, general household management, and some experience with livestock. The children are part of the arrangement and will provide supplementary labor appropriate to their ages. What kind of supplementary labor does a 5-year-old provide? Someone called from the crowd, and there was another wave of laughter. She can carry things, Mabel said. Her voice was flat and clear and loud enough that the people in the back heard her, and the laughter stopped the way laughter does when it runs into something that doesn't move. Cecil Potts cleared his throat. We'll start bidding at— I wouldn't bid a dime, said a man named Harker, who ran the biggest cattle operation south of the ridge, and who was not known for keeping his opinions to himself. He was standing near the front, thick-armed and red-faced, and he said it with the comfortable assurance of a man who knows the room agrees with him. 3 children, no land, no real skills to speak of. That's not a worker, that's a charity case. She can cook, said a woman's voice from somewhere in the crowd, but it was said quietly, the way you say something when you believe it but don't want to be associated with it. My cook can cook, Harker said. My cook doesn't come with 3 mouths I didn't hire. Mabel was looking at a fixed point somewhere above the crowd. Not at the mountains, not at the sky, just at nothing. The way you look when you are concentrating on staying very still inside yourself. Clara, on the step below her, was not looking at nothing. She was looking at Harker with an expression that was too old for her face. Starting bid, Cecil Potts tried again. Shall we say $5, said a voice from the back, and it was said in the tone of a joke, the kind of bid people make to get a laugh, and it got one. 6, said another voice, matching the same tone. 6.5, someone offered, and there was more laughter because everyone understood this wasn't real bidding. This was the crowd entertaining itself at Mabel Harlow's expense, and Cecil Potts knew it too and was sweating more than usual. Mabel did not move. She did not look down. Whatever she was holding on to inside herself, she was holding it with both hands. $10, said a voice that nobody had heard yet that morning. The laughter stopped. Not because $10 was a large amount, it wasn't particularly, but because of the voice that had said it. That voice belonged to Gideon Cross, and Gideon Cross did not come to labor auctions, and Gideon Cross did not bid on anything, and Gideon Cross was standing at the edge of the crowd where the square opened onto the main street, and every person in Red Hollow over the age of 10 knew exactly who he was and treated his presence anywhere with the kind of attention you give to weather. Gideon Cross owned the furthest ranch from town, 7 miles out, past the second ridge, on land that everyone agreed was more difficult than it was worth. He'd been there for 9 years. In those 9 years, he had come into town for supplies, for the occasional unavoidable piece of business, and for nothing else. He did not attend socials. He did not come to church. He had, in the first few years, received various invitations to various things, and had declined all of them without explanation until the invitations stopped coming. He was 41 years old and looked it, a tall man with dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that was more weathered than handsome, with a scar along his left jawline that he'd never explained to anyone. He'd arrived in Red Hollow from somewhere nobody could quite agree on. Some said Kansas, some said further east, some said it didn't matter where he'd come from because wherever it was, he'd left it hard. There had been a wife once. The story was told in fragments, that she died in the 2nd year, that it had been fever, that after that Gideon Cross had pulled everything inward and sealed it there. He ran his cattle alone or with 1 or 2 hired hands who never lasted long enough to become familiar. He paid his debts and his taxes and his obligations and left people alone, and he had a reputation, not for violence exactly, but for a quality that violence sometimes has, which is that you'd rather not find out where it ends. He was standing at the edge of the square now with his hat in his hand, which was unusual enough in itself, and he was looking at Cecil Potts with an expression that indicated he expected his bid to be taken seriously. The square was quiet. $10, Cecil Potts repeated carefully, as if testing whether the words would hold. I have $10 from Mr. Cross. Do I hear 11? Silence. The man with the flask near the back had stopped talking. Harker had turned to look at Gideon Cross with the expression of a man recalculating something. Do I hear any advance on 10? Cecil Potts tried, with less conviction. Nobody advanced. Sold, said Cecil Potts, with what sounded like relief, to Gideon Cross, $10. Mabel came down off the platform with her daughters and walked to where Gideon Cross was waiting. She stopped a few feet from him and looked up at him, and he looked back at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "I have 3 daughters," she said, as if he might not have noticed. "I know," he said. "The arrangement you're entering into?" "I know what the arrangement is, Mrs. Harlow." She looked at him for another moment. "You should know I won't be treated as something you've purchased." "I don't need to purchase anything," he said. "I need someone to run a house that's been running itself badly for 4 years. And you need somewhere to be that isn't this." He said it matter-of-factly, without either kindness or unkindness, the way you state a piece of arithmetic. "If that arrangement works, it works. If it doesn't, you'll be free to leave." It was not a warm offer. It was barely even an offer. But it was honest. And Mabel Harlow had been lied to with warmth enough times that honesty without warmth was something she'd learned to value. "All right," she said. Clara was looking up at Gideon Cross with her too old expression. He glanced down at her. "What's your name?" "Clara." "Can you work?" "Yes." "Good," he said, and picked up the satchel at his feet that she hadn't seen him set down, and turned toward the street. They had started to follow him when a voice said, "Cross." Gideon stopped. The voice belonged to Bartholomew Crow, who was standing 10 feet away and who had been watching the whole thing from beside the steps to the platform. Bartholomew Crow was 52 years old and built like a man who had once been fit and had since grown prosperous enough that fitness was no longer required of him. He wore good clothes, better than anyone else in the square, and he had a face that would have been pleasant if it wasn't for his eyes, which were the particular pale gray of a sky that has decided to do something unpleasant. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county. He owned the note on the Harlow homestead that had been one of the instruments of its foreclosure. He owned, in one form or another, pieces of most of the significant commerce in Red Hollow, and he was careful about how he'd come to own all of it, and he was very comfortable in the town's respect. "Cross," he said again, and there was something under the word that wasn't quite a warning and wasn't quite amusement. "That's quite a purchase you've made." Gideon turned around. He didn't say anything right away. He looked at Crow the way you look at something you've assessed before and haven't changed your assessment of. When he spoke, his voice was calm and even and audible to everyone still in the square. "These people are under my protection now," he said. "The woman and her children. I want that understood." Crow smiled the smile of a man who finds something funny that nobody else has caught yet. "Of course," he said. "Not as a courtesy," Gideon said. "As a fact." He looked at Crow for one more moment, then turned and walked toward the street, and Mabel and her daughters followed him, and behind them the square erupted in murmur and the particular buzzing energy of a place where something has happened that people will be talking about for a while. The wagon was a practical thing, not mean, but not comfortable either. Gideon loaded the family's bags into the back without ceremony, and they climbed up, and he took the reins and they left Red Hollow heading west toward the ridge. For the first mile, nobody spoke. Ada had fallen asleep against Mabel's side within 10 minutes of leaving town, the way small children fall asleep after tension breaks. June was watching the landscape with a focused attention that suggested she was cataloging everything. Clara was watching Gideon Cross's back from where she sat, studying him the way she studied most new things, like a problem she intended to solve. Mabel was trying to think clearly. She had done the only calculation available to her in that square and arrived at the only answer that existed, and she had made the decision without sentiment and without illusion, and she was going to stand by it. What she needed now was information, the kind of information you gather by watching. "How many cattle?" she asked. Gideon glanced back. "About 400, down from 6. "What happened to the other 200? A pause. "Had a hard winter 2 years ago. Lost some men I'd been relying on. The operation contracted." "You run it alone now?" "Mostly. I hire out during Roundup." She nodded, processing. "The house. How bad is it?" He was quiet for a moment, which told her something. "It's livable," he said finally. "That's not the same as good." "No," he said. "It isn't." Clara leaned forward. "What happened to your wife?" she asked. "Clara," Mabel said sharply. "It's all right," Gideon said, though his hands tightened briefly on the reins. "She died 8 years ago. Fever." "I'm sorry," Clara said, in a way that sounded like she meant it, which surprised him. "Thank you," he said. Another silence settled in, but it was a different quality of silence than before. less like a held breath and more like a space between two people who have exchanged something real and aren't yet sure what to do with it. The house was worse than livable and better than ruins, which put it somewhere in the middle of a range that Mabel had, in the last 14 months, learned to navigate. It was a solid structure. Whoever had built it to last. 2 stories of heavy timbered construction with a stone foundation and a wide porch that would have been pleasant if anyone had used it in the last several years. But the years of a single man with no apparent interest in his surroundings had accumulated like sediment. The kitchen was functional but grim. The main room was clean in the way that clean means the absence of deliberate dirt, not the presence of care. One of the upstairs windows had a crack that someone had covered with oilcloth, and then apparently forgotten about. The garden was a memory of itself, identifiable as a garden only by the remnants of its structure. The barn, at least, was in good shape. Gideon Cross's neglect did not extend to the barn. He showed them through the house with the economy of a man who isn't used to showing people through things, naming rooms and their functions without elaboration, and at the end he stopped at the foot of the stairs and said, "The 2 upper rooms are yours. You can decide among you how to use them." "Where do you sleep?" June asked. "The room at the end of the hall." "That's the same floor." "Yes," he said. June considered this with 8-year-old thoroughness. "Okay," she said, as if she had judged it acceptable. That night, after the girls were settled and Gideon had gone to do his evening work, Mabel stood in the kitchen alone and looked at it by the light of a single lamp. The grease of years was in the corners. The curtains on the window were faded to something that might have been blue once. One of the hooks for pots had bent at an angle that made hanging anything on it a commitment to uncertainty. She should have felt worse than she did. She'd expected to feel worse. Instead, she felt something closer to the sensation she'd had sometimes when she was a girl, and faced with a large, unpleasant task. A kind of grim settling in, the mind accepting the size of what was in front of it and beginning, without drama, to plan. She started with the curtains. By the time Gideon came back 2 hours later, the curtains were down and soaking in a bucket, and the kitchen window was open to the night air, and Mabel was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee she'd found in his stores and made without asking. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the empty window rod and the bucket. "The curtains needed washing," she said. "I know. There's coffee if you want it." He looked at her for a moment with an unreadable expression, then crossed to the stove, poured himself a cup, and sat down at the other end of the table. They sat there for a while in the partial dark without speaking, drinking their coffee, and it wasn't comfortable exactly, but it was functional, and functional was something. The girls adapted with the particular elasticity of children who have had no choice but to adapt. Clara took on work with the same sober competence she applied to everything, and by the 3rd day she had established herself as a functional presence in the kitchen, working beside her mother with minimal supervision and maximum attention. She asked questions about how things were done when she didn't know, listened to the answers completely, and did not ask the same question twice. June had found the horses. This wasn't a surprise. She had spent most of her 5 to 8 years with an intense and slightly inconvenient interest in any animal larger than a house cat. But the speed with which she established a working relationship with Gideon's horses was notable. He found her in the paddock on the 2nd morning, not doing anything wrong, just standing with her hand out while one of the mares considered her. He'd started to call her back and then stopped. The mare, a large bay with a reputation for uncertainty around strangers, was sniffing June's hand. He stood at the fence and watched. June didn't move, didn't make any sudden sounds, just waited with the specific patience of someone who had decided she was going to wait and had made her peace with however long it took. After a minute, the mare dropped her nose into June's palm. "She doesn't usually do that," Gideon said. June looked over her shoulder at him. "She was deciding," she said. He didn't have anything to say to that, so he said nothing and went to do his work. Ada was a different matter. Ada was 5 years old and had the practical consciousness of a 5-year-old, which meant that she perceived the world primarily through the lens of what was interesting and what was not. And she had decided within the first 24 hours that Gideon Cross was very interesting. She appeared in doorways he walked through. She asked him questions with no particular concern for whether the questions were appropriate. She showed him things she found, rocks, sticks, a beetle she'd discovered near the east fence, with the guileless enthusiasm of someone who assumes everything they find interesting is inherently worth sharing. He did not know how to deal with her. On the fourth day, she appeared at the barn door while he was repairing tack and asked him if horses had feelings. He kept working. "Why are you asking me?" "June says yes. Mama says probably. I want to know what you think." He thought about it. He did not usually have conversations with people about whether horses had feelings. "Yes," he said finally. "I think they do." Ada considered this. "What kind of feelings?" "Fear," he said. "Trust. Happiness, maybe. Something like it." "Do you have feelings?" He looked up from the tack. She was watching him with complete sincerity. "Yes," he said. "You don't act like it," she said, and walked away. He sat there for a moment after she left and then went back to the tack, and there was something moving in his chest that he didn't examine too closely. The town knew within a week. News in small places travels through some mechanism that isn't quite gossip and isn't quite news, just the constant ambient information sharing of people who are all watching the same small stage. The information that moved through Red Hollow was that Gideon Cross had installed Mabel Harlow and her 3 daughters at the Cross Ranch, and that she appeared to be running his house, and there were various interpretations of this, and few of them were generous. Some people thought it was practical. Gideon needed a housekeeper. Mabel needed work, and the arrangement, however unusual in its origins, was ultimately a business matter. Some people thought it was more than that, and said so in the way people say things when they intend the saying to be heard. Some people thought Gideon had made a foolish error and were waiting with comfortable interest to see how it collapsed. Nobody gave Mabel Harlow credit for anything she was actually doing, which was taking a neglected property and putting it back in order through daily consistent effort, starting with the kitchen and working outward. By the end of the first week, the kitchen was recognizable as a good kitchen. By the end of the second, the main room had been reorganized in ways that Gideon kept walking into and then stopping to assess, as if he wasn't sure whether the change was an improvement and kept arriving at the conclusion that it was. The garden was still a project. The season was against her. But she'd cleared enough of the dead matter that its actual bones were visible and the potential could be seen. Gideon said very little about any of this. But he also didn't object to any of it, and he had stopped doing certain things that she had taken over. Setting his own breakfast, for instance, which she had claimed on the second morning and which he had surrendered without comment. And he had started doing something she noticed only gradually, which was arriving back at the house at a time that could be described as deliberate rather than incidental, in time for the evening meal. They talked at meals, not deeply, not personally, but functionally, about the ranch, about what needed doing, about the girls' days, about the small mechanical concerns of a working property. It was the kind of conversation that looks like nothing from outside, but that Mabel recognized as something, because she had had years of meals with Thomas at which no real conversation occurred at all. And she knew the difference between 2 people sharing a table and 2 people merely eating in the same room. "There's a broken gate on the east paddock," she said one evening. "The one by the creek. A hinge has gone." He looked up from his plate. "How do you know about the east paddock gate?" "June showed me." He absorbed this. "I've been meaning to fix it." "I know. I can fix it if you show me how." He looked at her with an expression she'd been cataloging over 2 weeks. The expression he wore when she'd said something that required him to revise a previous assumption. "You want to fix a gate hinge." "I want to know how things work," she said, "so that if something needs doing, I don't have to wait for you to do it." "You won't be here long enough to—" He stopped. She waited. "I didn't mean it the way it sounds," he said. "How did you mean it?" A pause. "I assumed the arrangement was temporary, that you'd find something more suitable." "More suitable where?" she asked, not with bitterness, just with honest curiosity. "I'm 34 with 3 daughters and $10 to my name. This is the most suitable thing available to me right now. I intend to make good use of it." He looked at her for a long moment, then he nodded. "I'll show you the gate tomorrow," he said. Bob. Bartholomew Crow came to Red Hollow 3 times a week, which was more than a man of his property had any logistical reason to come to town. He came because his presence in town was a form of management, the visible expression of his reach, the reminder that his business touched enough of what happened in Red Hollow that it paid to stay current. He had been watching the situation at the Cross Ranch with the patient interest of a man who knows how to wait. Crow had known Mabel Harlow's situation before the auction. He had, in fact, been part of the mechanism that created it, The note on the Harlow homestead had passed through his office on its way to the bank, and there had been nothing technically wrong about the sequence of events that followed, just a series of entirely legal choices that happened to produce a particular outcome. He had not given this much thought afterward. It was simply how things worked, and if a family found themselves displaced by the ordinary machinery of debt and repayment, that was the machinery functioning correctly. What had interested him at the auction was not Mabel Harlow herself, but the possibility she represented. A widow with no land, no resources, and no alternatives was a woman with no leverage. He had intended, not precisely to help her, but to make himself available at the moment when being owed a favor by someone with no options was the safest kind of favor to be owed. He had been prepared to offer her work, menial, below her dignity, but work. And he had expected, with some confidence, that she would take it. He had not expected Gideon Cross. The problem with Gideon Cross was not that he was dangerous, though Crow had no illusions about that. The problem was that he was outside the web. Every significant person in Red Hollow had something that connected to Crow in some way. A debt, a business arrangement, a social obligation, a piece of history that needed to stay quiet. Gideon Cross had none of these. He had arrived 9 years ago from somewhere Crow's inquiries hadn't fully resolved. He had purchased his land outright with cash whose origins Crow had never established, and he had in 9 years given Crow nothing to work with. A man with nothing to lose and no obligations was an inconvenient thing. What bothered Crow more was the way Cross had said it, not asked permission, not offered assurance, not couched it in any of the social forms that allowed you to receive a statement and quietly undermine it later. Just turned to him in front of the whole square and stated it as a fact. These people are under my protection now. Crow had smiled because smiling was what you did, but the words had stayed with him. He began, in his methodical way, to think about what could be done. The first move was legal, and it was elegant. There was a question, Crow mentioned to his attorney, about the original transaction, the Harlow homestead. It had been resolved, of course, the property properly transferred, but there was a procedural matter, a question of whether certain documents had been filed in the correct order that might, not certainly, but might, complicate the chain of title in a way that had downstream implications for certain other properties in the area. The attorney understood what was being asked of him and began to draft accordingly. What arrived at Gideon's ranch 3 weeks after Mabel and her daughters was a letter from the county land office. It was written in the language of bureaucratic process, which is a language designed specifically to be difficult to understand on a first reading and alarming on a second. The summary, once you strip the language away, was this. There was a question about the provenance of a piece of property adjacent to the Cross Ranch, a small parcel of 30 acres that Gideon had purchased 6 years ago as a buffer between his grazing land and the road. The question was whether the title chain was clean. Gideon read the letter at the kitchen table that evening and read it again. What does it mean? Mabel asked. It means someone is trying to tie up my land in a question, he said. Can they? Not permanently, but they can slow things down, cost me time and money while it works through the county office. He set the letter down. His jaw was tight. It's Crow. How do you know? Because the parcel in question borders the road he uses for his cattle drives. He's wanted it for years. He looked at the letter. This isn't about the parcel. This is about whether I'll decide it's easier to give him what he wants than to fight about it. Mabel looked at the letter. Then she looked at him. What are you going to do? She asked. Fight about it, he said without hesitation. She nodded, and something settled in her expression that he didn't know how to name, but that looked from where he sat a lot like relief. Clara found her mother in the garden the next afternoon, which had become a routine. Mabel worked in the late afternoon while the light was good and while Ada napped, and Clara often came to sit nearby and talk or not talk depending on what she needed. She's sleeping, Clara reported, meaning Ada. Good. Mabel pulled a root that had been there long enough to have opinions about staying. June with the horses? Where else? They worked in silence for a while, Mabel digging and Clara removing debris from what she uncovered, and the system was one they'd arrived at without discussing it. Are we going to have to leave? Clara asked. Mabel kept working. She had a policy with Clara, who was old enough to deserve honesty and young enough to need it to be the right kind of honesty. Not if I can help it, she said. Do you think he'd let us stay if— I think Mr. Cross keeps his word, Mabel said, and I think he said we could stay. Clara was quiet for a moment. I think he likes Ada, she said. Mabel smiled, though she kept her face down toward the garden. I think you're right. He doesn't know what to do with her. No, but he doesn't do what some men do, which is pretend she isn't there. He answers her, even when the question is strange. Clara thought about this. Do you like him? She asked. Mabel paused in her digging. It was not the kind of question she'd expected from an 11-year-old, and the fact that it was exactly the right question made her slightly cautious. I respect him, she said, which is more than I can say for most people I've met. That's not the same as like— No, Mabel agreed. It isn't. She started digging again. Give it time, Clara. Clara nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer, or at least accepting that it was all she was going to get, and went back to pulling debris. And they worked together in the late afternoon light, while inside the house a 5-year-old slept, and somewhere in the paddock June was talking to the bay mare, in the quiet voice she used for horses and for nobody else, and the first real roots of something were going down into the ground of the Cross Ranch, whether anyone was paying attention to them or not. On the day that the letter from the land office had arrived, as Gideon sat at his kitchen table reading it a second time, he had a moment, not a long one, but real, of looking at the kitchen as it was now and thinking about the kitchen as it had been 5 weeks ago. The curtains were back up, washed and rehung. The hook for the pots had been straightened. There was a jar of dried wildflowers on the windowsill that Ada had put there and nobody had removed. The smell of that evening's meal still hung in the air, something with herbs from the garden that Mabel had identified as salvageable and incorporated into the cooking with the same pragmatic resourcefulness she applied to everything. He thought about the years of eating alone in this kitchen, the years of meals that were fuel and nothing else, the years of the house making no sound after dark except the settling of its timbers and the wind off the ridge. He looked at the letter in his hands. The threat was real. Crow was careful and patient, and he had resources that Gideon could not match in a prolonged legal fight. If this was the first move, the second and third were already planned. The man had moved against Mabel Harlow once, had found her outside his reach, and had now adjusted his target. Gideon was not a man who frightened easily, and he knew it. He also knew that confidence in the face of real danger was only useful if it was accompanied by clear thinking, and so he sat in his kitchen that smelled like someone's home and thought clearly about what was coming. What he arrived at was not simple, and it was not comfortable, but it was honest. Bartholomew Crow had done this before, and would do it again. And the only question was whether the people in his path would stand still long enough for it to work. He folded the letter carefully and set it aside. From upstairs, he heard the muffled sound of Clara's voice reading to Ada before bed, the way she did every night. Some story, the same one apparently, because he'd heard certain phrases repeated enough times to know them, and then Ada's laugh at whatever the funny part was. He sat in the kitchen a while longer, listening to the house make sounds it hadn't made in 8 years, and he made a decision that had been forming slowly for 5 weeks without him acknowledging it. He was not going to let Bartholomew Crow touch any of this. He didn't examine why he felt that with the force that he did. He was a practical man, and he dealt in facts. And the fact was that there were 4 people in his house now, and they were his responsibility, and they had trusted him. The woman with her steady, pragmatic trust, and the girl with her watchful evaluation, and the one who asked him about horses, and the smallest one who thought he didn't have feelings, and he was not going to let anything touch them. That was all. He got up from the table and went to do his evening check of the barn, and outside the night was cold and clear, and the ridge stood dark against the stars. And somewhere on the other side of it, Bartholomew Crow was undoubtedly sitting in comfort thinking about his next move. Let him think, Gideon thought. He latched the barn door behind him and went back inside to where the lamp was burning. The letter from the county land office sat on the corner of Gideon's desk for 6 days before anything came of it, and in those 6 days Mabel watched him the way she'd learned to watch people who didn't show much on the outside, by watching what they did instead of what they said. What Gideon did was work. He'd always worked, but there was a different quality to it now, a controlled restlessness, like a man burning something off. He was out before dawn and back after dark. And at meals he was present in body, but some part of him was somewhere else, running calculations she wasn't privy to. She didn't push. She understood the need to think things through in private before you could talk about them, and she had enough of her own quiet thinking to occupy her. What she was thinking about was Bartholomew Crow. She knew his name the way everyone in Red Hollow knew his name, unavoidably, the way you know the name of a river that floods. She knew the outline of his reach, the cattle operation, the lending, the way certain decisions in town seemed to originate with him, even when they appeared to come from somewhere else. She had not known, until Gideon told her, that the note on her homestead had passed through Crow's office. When he said it, she'd felt something go still inside her, the particular stillness that comes when a thing you've been trying not to understand finally becomes clear. She'd lost her home to a man who hadn't needed it and had taken it anyway. Not because he was cruel exactly, but because acquiring things was simply what he did, and the line between what was necessary and what was available had long since dissolved for him. That was, she had found, the specific character of a certain kind of powerful man. He didn't want things because he needed them. He wanted them because not wanting them would mean there were limits to what he could have. On the 7th day, Gideon came in from the barn at mid-morning, which was unusual, and found her in the kitchen putting up the dried herbs she'd pulled from the garden. "I'm going into town," he said, "to see the land clerk." She set down what she was holding. "Do you want me to come?" He looked at her. She could see him weighing something. "It might help," he said, "if there's someone who can read through the secondary filings while I'm talking to Hollis." "I can read through filings." "I know you can." They looked at each other for a moment, and something passed between them that neither of them named. "I'll get my coat," she said. The county land office was a single room attached to the back of the courthouse, staffed by a clerk named Roland Hollis, who had held the position for 19 years and who had developed over those years the specific quality of a man who processes paperwork for a living and has made his peace with it, which is to say, he was methodical, incurious, and slightly defensive when anyone implied that something in his records might be irregular. Gideon set the letter on the counter. Hollis read it, and his expression did the thing expressions do when a man recognizes a document he wishes weren't in front of him. "Yes," he said carefully. "This came through the standard review process." "Who filed the challenge?" "I'm not at liberty to—" "Roland," Gideon said. His voice hadn't changed, but something in the quality of his patience shifted in a way that was perceptible. "We've known each other 11 years. I'm not asking you to violate anything. I'm asking who filed a legal challenge against my property title." Hollis looked at the counter. "The challenge was filed through a proxy attorney, Dennison and Associates." Mabel, standing beside the filing cabinet where she'd been going through the secondary records, said without looking up, "Dennison is Crow's attorney." Hollis said nothing. "The procedural question in the letter," Gideon said, "is it legitimate?" There is a technical basis for the inquiry," Hollis said carefully. "Whether it rises to the level of a genuine title complication is a matter for the county assessor to determine." "How long does that take?" 3 months, possibly 6. "And during that time?" "The parcel is in question. Any transactions involving it would be complicated." Gideon stood there for a moment. Then he picked up the letter. "I'll be getting an attorney." "That's your right," Hollis said. "It is." Gideon turned to go, then stopped. "Roland, if anything else comes through regarding my property, anything at all, I want to know about it before it becomes a letter on my desk." Hollis looked uncomfortable in the way of a man being asked to do something that wasn't wrong but wasn't entirely inside the lines either. He looked at Gideon Cross for a long moment and then looked at the counter. "I'll see what I can do," he said. Outside, they stood on the courthouse steps in the flat October light, and Mabel said, "He'll tell Crow you came in." "I know. Does that matter? It tells Crow I'm not ignoring it, which is what he'd be hoping for." He looked down the main street of Red Hollow, which was going about its ordinary business around them. "The challenge isn't about the parcel. You understood that. It's about whether you'll spend 6 months and money you don't have fighting a procedural question and come out the other side smaller," she said, "and whether watching that happen makes the next thing easier." He looked at her. "Yes. So what's the next thing?" "I don't know yet. That's what worries me. It was, she would think later, the most honest thing he'd said to her yet. Not the content of it, but the fact of it. That he'd said he was worried plainly, without dressing it up in confidence or dismissing it as a minor concern. She had been married to a man who could not admit uncertainty even when certainty was killing him, and the straightforwardness of Gideon's admission landed on her like something she hadn't known she needed. "Then we figure it out," she said. He looked at her again, and this time the assessment in his eyes was different from the one she'd been cataloging, not the measurement of a practical man evaluating a practical situation, but something more direct and less comfortable for both of them. "We," he said. "That's what I said." A beat. "All right," he said. God. The winter that year came in stages, which was worse in some ways than if it had arrived all at once. There were warm days in October that made you think it was being held off, and then a hard frost in early November that killed anything left in the garden, and then a week of relative warmth again. And then in the second week of November, it came in properly and stayed. The ranch contracted around itself the way working properties do in winter. The distances between tasks shortened, the routines compressed, the small contained world of the house and barn and the space between them becoming the whole of daily life. Gideon was around more, which changed the texture of the days in ways that nobody commented on, but everybody felt. He and Mabel worked out a division of the daily work without ever discussing it directly, which was how she'd found most things got worked out between practical people. Not through negotiation, but through observation and gradual accommodation, each person filling the spaces the other left. She ran the house and the kitchen, he ran the cattle and the property. But the lines blurred at the edges in ways that were sometimes surprising. He taught her to fix the gate hinge as he'd promised, and then found himself teaching her 3 other things she'd identified as needing to know. How to diagnose a problem with the flue in the kitchen stove, how to treat a horse's hoof for a basic injury, how to read the particular kind of clouds that meant a real storm in 2 days rather than 1. She learned all of it with the same complete attention she applied to everything, the attention of someone who understood that knowledge was a resource you accumulated precisely because you never knew when you'd need it. "You're going to run out of things to teach me," she said one afternoon, looking up from the hoof she'd been examining on the older gelding. "There's always more," he said. "You sound almost sorry about that." He looked at her from where he was standing with the gelding's lead. She was crouched in the straw, her hair escaped from its pins on one side, her expression focused and satisfied in a way she got when she'd done something correctly. He looked away. "I'm not sorry about it," he said. She stood, dusting straw from her knees. "Gideon." It was the first time she'd used his first name. They both noticed. "Yes," he said. "Whatever Crow does next, I want to be useful to you. Not managed, not kept safe in the kitchen while you handle it. Useful." He was quiet for a moment. The gelding shifted his weight beside him. "I know," he said. "Do you?" "I do." He looked at her directly. "I'm not Thomas Harlow, Mabel." She held his gaze. She knew he hadn't meant it as a criticism of a dead man, just as a statement of fact about himself, and she received it that way. "I know you're not," she said. The gelding blew out a breath, and both of them looked at the horse and then away from each other, and Mabel went to hang up the tools she'd been using, and Gideon went to fill the water trough, and neither of them said anything else, but the air between them had shifted in a way that winter air does when something underneath it has changed temperature. The next move from Crow came in early December, and it wasn't legal. It came in the form of a man named Petty, Walt Petty, who did odd work around the county and who had a flexible relationship with the exact nature of what that work entailed. He showed up at the ranch on a Tuesday morning while Gideon was out on the east pasture, which Mabel suspected was not a coincidence. She answered the door. Petty was a rangy man with a face that had been rearranged at some point in the past and hadn't quite settled back into anything agreeable. He held his hat in front of him and had the practiced manner of a person who has learned to seem casual while delivering things that aren't. "Mrs. Harlow," he said, "I've got a message from Mr. Crow." "Mr. Crow can send his messages through proper channels," she said. He figured this was more personal. Petty didn't move from the step. "He wanted you to know that he has a great deal of sympathy for your situation. A widow woman, 3 children. It's difficult times. He said to tell you there's a standing offer of employment at the Crow household. Cook and housekeeper. Comfortable quarters, fair wages. Mabel looked at him. He also said to mention that the employment offer includes provisions for your children's schooling. He's a generous man. He's a man who forecloses on widows, she said, and then offers them jobs. Petty's easy manner didn't change, but something behind it adjusted slightly. That's a harsh way of looking at a business matter, Mrs. Harlow. Is there a softer way? Mr. Crow don't hold grudges. He's concerned that your current situation might not be everything it appears. My current situation is none of Mr. Crow's concern. He's concerned about the character of the man you're working for. The pause before working for was deliberate, and she knew it. She kept her expression flat. Tell Mr. Crow thank you for his concern, she said, and that I'm quite satisfied with my current employment. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand still on the latch, and she breathed slowly and deliberately, and she did not let herself shake until she heard the horse moving away from the house. And then she sat down on the bench by the door and let herself shake briefly, because she'd found you had to give fear somewhere to go, or it collected in you wrong. When Gideon came back at noon, she told him. He stood in the kitchen and listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He's trying to move you, he said, separately from me, because he knows if he challenges me directly, he has less control of the outcome. I know why he did it. She looked at him. I want you to know I told him no. I assumed you did. I want you to know it clearly, not assumed, known. She met his eyes. I'm not going anywhere. He looked at her for a long moment. Something crossed his face that he didn't have the habit of showing, and he let it cross and didn't stop it, and she saw it and didn't look away. Thank you, he said. It was a small thing to say and entirely insufficient for what it was carrying, and they both knew it, and neither of them made it larger than it was, which was the right choice. Clara heard about Petty's visit from June, who had seen the horse from the paddock, and had described it to her sister with the detail-oriented precision of someone who has spent a lot of time studying animals and applied the same attention to humans. Clara processed this information in her characteristic way, quietly, thoroughly, and without alerting anyone to the fact that she was processing it. That evening, after supper, she sat at the table doing her schoolwork while Gideon was still in the room going over his accounts. This was a new development in the household's patterns, that he and the children occupied the same space in the evenings without it being remarkable. It had happened gradually, the way most real things happen. Mr. Cross, Clara said without looking up from her work. Yes. If someone is trying to make us leave, does that mean this place is dangerous for us to be? He set down his pen. He had a policy he'd arrived at with Clara, parallel to the policy Mabel had with her, which was that she asked real questions and deserved real answers. It means someone wants to make it feel dangerous, he said, so that you'll leave on your own. Is there a difference? There's a big one. Someone making a place feel dangerous has to keep making it feel that way. It costs them something. If you hold your ground, eventually the cost becomes more than they want to pay. Clara thought about this. What if they don't care what it costs them? Everyone cares eventually, he said. That's the one thing you can count on. She went back to her work. He watched her for a moment, this precise, watchful child who had been 11 years old for what felt like a very long time, and felt the weight of what he'd said, and hoped it was true. The social pressure was quieter and slower than the legal challenge, but in its way, more wearing. It worked through small omissions and small inclusions. The way the woman at the dry goods store took a half-second longer to acknowledge Mabel than she took with other customers. The way certain conversations in the hotel lobby paused when she walked past. The way an invitation to a sewing circle that had gone to every woman on the west side of the county somehow did not find its way to the Cross Ranch. Mabel was not surprised by any of this and was only occasionally hurt by it, which she considered progress. She had grown up in a place and a time where the social machinery of women's communities was both a genuine resource and a genuine weapon, and she had experienced both edges. What made it harder now was that she was not weathering it alone. Her daughters were weathering it alongside her, and the exclusion that a grown woman could absorb without lasting damage was a different thing when it was a child absorbing it. June, who did not care about social circles and had friends among the horses she valued more than most people, was essentially unaffected. Ada was too young to understand the mechanism, only to feel its effects when children in town didn't play with her, and she had the resilience of the very small who haven't yet learned to expect differently. Clara was the one Mabel worried about. Clara was at the age where the opinion of other girls was just beginning to matter, and she was navigating it alone. And the intelligence that made her perceptive in useful ways also made her feel the slight more accurately than someone duller would have. Mabel found her one afternoon sitting on the porch steps in a posture that communicated what she wasn't saying. She sat beside her. "Martha Kellen told me at the store that her mother said you're living in sin," Clara said. Mabel sat with this for a moment. "What did you say to Martha Kellen?" "I said her mother should mind her own business." "That's not very diplomatic." "I know." A pause. "Was it wrong?" Mabel looked out across the yard, at the barn, at the mountains beyond the ridge in the late afternoon light. "Martha Kellen's mother is repeating what somebody told her to think," she said, "which is a habit a lot of people have. But Martha Kellen is 11 years old and probably just said what she'd heard, and she doesn't know any better yet. So I should have been nicer. I think you should know the difference between a person choosing to be cruel and a person repeating something they were given," Mabel said, "and act accordingly." Clara was quiet. "Mama, are you happy here?" Mabel did not answer immediately, which was itself a kind of answer. She looked at the yard, the barn, the garden she'd spent 2 months putting back in order, the window of the kitchen through which, if she looked, she could see the herbs she'd hung to dry, the hooks that now held things reliably, the jar of wildflowers Ada had placed on the sill and nobody had removed. "I think I'm becoming something," she said finally. "I'm not sure happy is the right word for it, but it's real." Clara considered this. "Okay," she said, and leaned her shoulder against her mother's arm, and they sat there together on the porch steps in the cooling afternoon until Ada came out looking for them, and June called from the paddock that the bay mare had done something remarkable, and everyone needed to come see immediately. Pitié. Gideon rode into Red Hollow alone on the last Friday of November, and went to the office of a lawyer named Ames, not Dennison, and not anyone connected to Crow's usual circle, and retained him to respond to the land challenge. The retainer cost him money he'd been holding back against the winter, which was a fact he registered and moved past. On his way back through the main street, he passed Bartholomew Crow coming out of the bank. They stopped in the street about 15 feet apart, in the specific way 2 men stop when each of them knows the other's business and neither of them is pretending otherwise. "Gideon," Crow said, with the warmth he deployed the way another man might draw a weapon. "I hear you visited the land office." "You heard right." Waste of time, I'd have thought. And money. He tilted his head slightly. "How are you finding the new household arrangement? That's a lot of mouths to feed off what your operation brings in." "My operation's my concern," Gideon said. "Of course." Crow looked at him with the pale gray eyes that gave so little away. "I hope she's settling in all right, the widow. She's had a hard time of it." "She's had a hard time caused by specific decisions," Gideon said. "By specific people." Crow smiled. It was a good smile, practiced and warm-looking. "You know, Gideon, I've always respected a man who speaks plainly, even when he's plain about things he doesn't fully understand." A beat. "The Harlow note was a legal transaction. The bank made a legal decision. I don't control the bank." "You influence it." "I have accounts there. Most people do." He spread his hand slightly, a gesture of reasonableness, of mild bewilderment at the suggestion. "I'd hate for this misunderstanding to complicate what has otherwise been a peaceful county." It was threaded with meaning, and they both knew it. "I don't misunderstand anything," Gideon said, "and I don't want a peaceful county. I want a just one." Crow looked at him for a long moment, and beneath the practiced warmth of his expression, something adjusted. Not anger. Crow was too controlled for visible anger, but something colder. "Well," he said pleasantly, "that's an ambitious thing to want." He walked past Gideon toward his horse, and Gideon stood in the street and watched him go. What he felt was not fear. He was past the age where he mistook adrenaline for fear. What he felt was the specific clarity you get when a situation becomes unambiguous, when all the maybe and perhaps falls away and what's left is the shape of the thing as it actually is. Crow was not going to stop. He was too far in and too comfortable in his methods. The legal challenge was not going to be the last move. Gideon turned his horse toward home. The ridge was clear in the late afternoon, the mountains clean against the sky going orange at the edges, and somewhere on the other side of it, his house was lit and his people were in it. He rode hard and thought clearly, and by the time he came over the last rise and saw the light in the kitchen window, he had a reasonable idea of what was coming and no plan for stopping it that didn't involve standing directly in front of it, which was, he thought, probably what was going to happen anyway. He put his horse in the barn and went inside, and Mabel looked up from the stove and read something in his face. "Tell me," she said. He sat down at the table. "He's not going to let this go," he said. She turned back to the stove. Her hands moved steadily with what she was doing. "I know," she said. "It's going to get harder before it gets better." "I know that too." He looked at her back, the straight line of her spine, the set of her shoulders, the way she kept doing what she was doing while she absorbed what he was saying. "Mabel," she stopped, didn't turn yet. "Yes. I need to ask you something." She turned then, with the wooden spoon still in her hand and her eyes level on him. "When it gets harder," he said, "I need to know you're going to stay." The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the stove. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had bought her dignity for $10 and kept his word about every single thing since and asked for nothing and given more than he knew, and she made a decision that she'd probably been moving toward for weeks without naming it. "I already told you," she said, "I'm not going anywhere." It wasn't a declaration, and it wasn't a promise exactly, just a fact stated for the second time, and the second time was the one that counted. Outside, the wind came off the ridge and moved through the dark yard, and inside the lamp burned on the table between them. And upstairs Ada was already asleep, and June was brushing her hair, and Clara was reading, and the house made all the sounds of a place that has people in it who intend to stay. The hardest part of waiting for something bad to happen is that ordinary life keeps going in the middle of it. December moved through the Cross Ranch the way December always did at that elevation. Slowly, with intention, the cold settling into the ground and the timbers of the house until it became the primary fact of each day. Mabel kept the kitchen warm and the pantry organized and the household running with the same methodical competence she'd brought to everything since September. And Gideon managed his cattle through the first serious cold snaps. And the girls moved through their days with the specific adaptability of children who had made a place their own without quite realizing they were doing it. Ada had started calling Gideon by his first name. Not Mr. Cross, not Sir, just Gideon, the way she said everything, directly and without ceremony. He'd noticed the first time she did it and hadn't corrected her. Mabel had watched him not correct her and filed that away with the other things she was filing. June had, through some negotiation that nobody was entirely clear on, been given partial responsibility for the bay mare. This meant that every morning before breakfast she was in the paddock regardless of temperature, and every evening she was there again. And the mare had stopped being uncertain about anything involving June specifically, which Gideon said was notable for that particular horse, and which June received with the satisfaction of someone who had expected nothing less. Clara had begun helping Gideon with his accounts on Friday evenings. This had started accidentally. She'd asked a question about a figure she'd seen on a paper he'd left on the table. He'd answered it. She'd asked a follow-up question that indicated she'd understood the first answer. And an hour later, they were going through the ledger together with the particular dynamic of an older person who has found someone younger worth talking to seriously. Mabel watched this from across the room and felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Something between gratitude and grief, because her daughter deserved exactly this and had been missing it for over a year. It was, taken whole, the closest thing to a functional life that any of them had inhabited in a long time, which was, of course, exactly when Bartholomew Crow escalated. But the first sign was not dramatic. It came on a Wednesday in mid-December when a man named Garrett, who ran a modest sheep operation 4 miles north of town and who had always been on cordial terms with Gideon, came to the ranch with a look on his face that said he wished he were somewhere else. Gideon met him in the yard. "I won't stay," Garrett said. He was a short, weathered man who communicated primarily through the angle of his hat brim, and right now the angle said deeply uncomfortable. "I just came to—" "There's talk, Gideon. I figured you should hear it from someone who isn't enjoying it." "What kind of talk?" Garrett looked at his boots. "Crow's been saying things. About the arrangement here. About the woman. He cleared his throat. About what kind of arrangement it actually is. Gideon's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. People can say what they want. He's not just saying it at the social, he's saying it to people who owe him things. And when Crow says something to people who owe him things, it starts to become what people believe. Garrett looked up. He's also been suggesting that the legal question on your parcel is more serious than it looks, that the whole title on your east section might be in question. He's telling it to the men who do business with you. He's trying to make me look like a bad credit risk. He's doing it quietly. That's the thing. He's not standing in the street saying it. He's saying it over dinner and in the bank and in the places where things get decided. A pause. Rafferty at the feed store told me he's been advised to be careful about extending credit to you. Gideon stood in the cold and absorbed this. Rafferty had been extending him credit every winter for 8 years. I appreciate you coming, he said. I can't. Garrett stopped. The hat brim went lower. I got my own note at that bank, Gideon. I'm not in a position to stand against him publicly. I just wanted you to know. I understand. Garrett left without saying anything else, and Gideon went inside and told Mabel, and she listened and then said, He's squeezing the supply lines. Yes. If you can't get credit at the feed store and winter's not half done, I know. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. How much do we have in the larder? He looked at her. Mabel. How much? He told her. She nodded once, running calculations he could see moving behind her eyes. It's tight, but it's manageable, she said. We reduce what we don't need and make do. I know how to make do. She looked at him directly. And we pay cash at Rafferty's until this is resolved. Don't give Crow the satisfaction of watching you short on feed. The cash reserve is meant for spring. Then we'll find another way in spring. She said it with a flatness that was not dismissal but certainty. The certainty of someone who has navigated genuine scarcity and come out the other side knowing it was survivable. He wants you to feel it closing in. Don't let him feel it working. Gideon looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. All right, he said. What he didn't say, because it wasn't the time, and he hadn't found the right words for it yet, was that the way she said we had started to do something to him that he hadn't expected and didn't know how to account for. Christmas came and went with the ranch-bound quietness of a household that has no community to celebrate with, which should have felt like a deprivation and instead felt, in the specific contained way of that winter, like something else. Mabel cooked more than was strictly practical. The girls decorated the main room with pine branches they'd cut from the tree line and dried berries from a jar she'd been saving, and the result was not elegant, but it was genuine, which was better. Gideon had gone into town the week before and come back with 4 packages wrapped in brown paper, which he'd placed under the pine arrangement with the slightly stiff manner of a man who is doing something he wants to do but is uncertain how it will be received. 1 for each of the girls and 1 for Mabel. Nothing extravagant, practical things he'd paid attention to long enough to know would be useful or wanted. A good pair of gloves for Clara, the right size. A small illustrated book about horses for June, which she received with a wordless intensity that was more gratitude than most people expressed with speech. A soft cloth doll with yarn hair for Ada, because Ada was still 5 and 5-year-olds needed dolls regardless of circumstances. For Mabel, a decent pen and a bottle of ink, because he'd noticed her writing in the evenings with a pen that was on its last legs, working around the inconsistency of it, and he thought she deserved a pen that worked reliably. She held it for a moment. Thank you, she said, and the words were simple, but the way she said them wasn't. He gave a short nod and went to do the morning chores, and Clara watched this exchange from across the room with the focused attention she gave to things she was learning. January was when things got harder. The attorney Ames sent word that the land challenge was proceeding as expected, slowly and expensively, but that there were signs of additional filings being prepared, which suggested the strategy was not to win the challenge, but to multiply it, to create enough legal noise that managing it consumed everything Gideon had. A week after that, 2 of the men who'd agreed to help with the late winter cattle work sent word that they wouldn't be coming. No explanation from either of them, which was explanation enough. And then, on the first Thursday of February, Mabel went to the dry goods store for supplies and found that the account she'd been running there had been, the owner couldn't quite meet her eyes while he said it, placed under review. He was sorry. It wasn't personal. She paid cash and carried the supplies out herself and loaded them into the wagon and drove home in the bright cold air with her back straight and her jaw set. And she did not cry until she was past the second ridge and sure nobody could see her. And then she stopped the wagon and cried briefly and practically, the way she'd learned to cry when she had to, getting it done and putting it away and moving on. And then she drove the rest of the way home. She told Gideon that evening after the girls were in bed. He sat at the table and listened, and his face did the thing it did when he was controlling something with effort. "He's reaching into every place we touch," he said. "He's been planning this longer than we've been watching for it," she said. "He's patient. More patient than I've given him credit for." She poured coffee she hadn't asked if he wanted, and set it in front of him, and poured one for herself and sat down. The lamp was between them on the table and the shadows were long. "Gideon," she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly." "All right. Is there any version of this where giving him what he wants ends it? The parcel, or some concession, is there a version where he takes it and stops?" He thought about it, which she respected because a less honest man would have said no immediately. He turned it over genuinely. "No," he said finally, "because it was never about the parcel. That's just the first handle he found. If I give him the parcel, he finds another handle." He looked at her. "Men like Crow don't stop because you give them things. They stop when it costs them more than they want to pay, or when someone makes them stop." She nodded. She'd thought the same thing, but had wanted to hear him say it. "So what do we do?" she asked. He was quiet. The fire in the stove settled. "We stop reacting," he said. "We stop playing the game he's laid out, and we make him play ours." "What does that look like?" "It looks like we stop trying to outlast him quietly." He looked at her across the lamp. "And we give him something to react to instead." What happened on the night of February 11th was not a surprise in the way that truly unexpected things are a surprise. It was more like the arrival of something that had been coming long enough that when it came, the first feeling was almost recognition. Mabel woke to the smell of smoke. She was out of bed and in the hallway before she was fully awake, moving on the particular instinct of a person who has lived in wooden buildings all their life and knows what that smell means at night. She got Claire and June up first. June was already sitting up, sharp-eared from years of listening for animals in distress, and took Ada from her bed, still half asleep, and got them all down the stairs and out the front door into the February dark. The barn was on fire. It had caught on the east side, which was the side away from the house, which was— she registered this fact and set it aside for later— not an accident. It had been burning long enough that the east wall was fully engaged, orange light pushing hard through the gaps in the timbers, black smoke rolling up against the stars. The sound was something she hadn't expected, the particular roar and crack of large-scale fire, a sound that was almost geological. Gideon was already there. He had gotten the horses out. All but one, she found out later, a older gelding who had panicked back instead of forward and who they lost in the first 10 minutes. He was in the yard with the horses on their leads, his face lit orange, his shirt singed at the sleeve, and when he turned and saw her and the girls, his expression went through several things very quickly. "Everyone's out?" he said. "Everyone's out." He turned back to the barn. There was nothing to be done about the barn. He knew it. She knew it. The bucket line they managed to form, Mabel and Clara working frantically, June watching the horses with an iron grip on 4 leads at once, Ada sitting on the cold ground where Mabel had put her and staying there because she understood this was serious. The bucket line kept the fire from reaching the outbuildings. That was all it could do. The barn burned. It took 2 hours to burn down to something manageable, and by the time the last of it was controlled, the sky was beginning to gray in the east, and all 4 of them were covered in ash and smoke, and the yard smelled like the end of something. Gideon stood at the edge of what had been his barn and looked at the wreckage. Mabel stood beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. "The old gelding," he said finally. His voice was flat. "I know," she said. Another silence. 7 years of equipment, he said. The tack, the tools, the winter feed stores. She looked at the ruins. The stone foundation was still standing. Everything built on top of it was gone. "Gideon." Her voice was quiet. "It was set." "Yes." "The east side. Away from the house, but close enough to the paddock that if the horses hadn't gotten out, yes. He said it without looking at her, still looking at the barn. He's done calculating. He's moved to something else. What do we do? He turned from the ruins and looked at her, and his face was ash-streaked and set, and something in his eyes had resolved in the way things resolve when a person has passed through a particular threshold and come out different on the other side. We don't run, he said. I'm not running. I know you're not. He looked at her for a long moment. Mabel, I need to ask you something. Behind them, Clara had gathered her sisters and was sitting with them on the porch steps. Ada against her side, June still holding the leads of 2 horses with an expression that was trying very hard to be older than 11. The sky was going from gray to the first cold blue of early morning. Ask, she said. Marry me, he said. It was not romantic, and it was not eloquent, and he knew it. He said it straight, the way he said everything, without decoration. She looked at him. She took in the ash on his face and the singed sleeve and the barn behind him and the 3 girls on the porch steps and the horses that were alive because he'd gone in after them. And she looked at him for a long moment. You're asking me now, she said. Like this. I'm asking you now because now is when it matters, he said. Because if we're married, it changes what he can do legally with the arrangement here. It changes your standing and the girl's standing. And because... He stopped. Because what? He looked at her, and the thing she'd seen moving in him for months was right there on his face, unguarded, the way it gets when a person is tired enough and has just watched enough burn. Because I want to, he said, because this is real to me. Whatever it's been for you, it's been real to me since before I knew what to do with it. She stood in the cold gray morning and looked at this man who had bought her dignity and kept it safe and taught her to fix gate hinges and put a pen in her hand for Christmas and gone into a burning barn for the horses. And she thought about Thomas, and she thought about the auction platform, and she thought about 14 months of navigating alone, and she thought about Clara on the porch steps with her sisters, and about Ada calling him by his first name without being told not to, and she thought about the kitchen window with the wildflowers on the sill. Yes, she said, not swept up, not romantic, just clear, the same way she said most true things. He nodded once. She thought she saw something release in him. I'll go see the magistrate on Monday, he said. Good. Behind them, Ada's voice came from the porch steps. What are they saying? Clara's voice quiet. They're deciding something. What? A pause. Then Clara, in the careful tone of someone who has figured it out. Something good. They were married on a Wednesday morning in the magistrate's office in Red Hollow, with Clara and June and Ada as witnesses and the magistrate's secretary as the second required witness and nobody else. Mabel wore the best dress she had, which was still not much. Gideon wore a clean shirt. The ceremony was about 4 minutes long and entirely without ceremony, and when it was done, the magistrate shook their hands and Ada announced that she was hungry, and they went to the hotel for breakfast, the 5 of them around a table, and it was the first time they'd been in a public space in Red Hollow as a family, and everyone in the room knew it. The looks were various. Some were genuinely curious. Some were the narrow-eyed kind. One woman, older, who ran the millinery, caught Mabel's eye and nodded, just once, with something in her expression that wasn't quite approval, but was close enough to recognition to matter. Clara sat with her back straight and her chin level in the way she'd sat on that auction platform, and Mabel felt a fierce pride that made her throat tight. Ada ate her eggs and asked the server if they had any pie. June watched the room with her quiet attention, and when Gideon caught her eye across the table, gave him a small nod of her own, the kind of nod that means things are acceptable. He returned it. Is your name Cross now? Ada asked her mother, with her mouth still full. Don't talk with your mouth full, Mabel said. And yes. Are we all cross? A beat. Mabel and Gideon looked at each other across the table. If you want to be, Gideon said. Ada thought about this with the serious thoroughness she applied to all important questions. Yes, she decided. Ada Cross is a better name. June looked at her plate. June Cross, she said quietly, trying it. She didn't say anything else, but she didn't not say anything else either, and that was enough. Clara was looking at her eggs. Her jaw worked once. Clara, Mabel said softly. Clara looked up. Her eyes were bright in a way she was clearly working to control. "You don't have to," Mabel said. "I want to," Clara said, and then to Gideon with the directness she'd had since the first day. "Is that all right with you?" Gideon looked at this child who had evaluated him from the top of those auction steps and had been evaluating him ever since with the unsparing attention of someone who gave her trust carefully and kept it carefully once given. "It's more than all right," he said. Clara nodded and looked back at her eggs and did not cry, which cost her something, and he could see it cost her something, and he respected it. The town knew by evening. The news traveled the way news always traveled in Red Hollow, through the invisible channels of a place where everybody's business was eventually common property, and by the time the Cross family drove back through town on their way home, the information was already in circulation. Crow heard it over dinner. The man who told him watched Crow's face while he said it and found it harder to read than usual. The warmth that was normally there for social occasions was absent, replaced by something flatter and more deliberate. "Is that so?" Crow said. "Married this morning. Magistrate's office." Crow was quiet for a moment. His fork moved against his plate with a precise small sound. "Well," he said, "that changes some things." "Does it change what you—" "I said it changes some things." He set down his fork. "Not everything." What Crow understood, and what his dinner companion did not, was that the marriage was a direct move. Cross had understood the legal dimensions of the situation and acted, and the fact that he had acted meant he was done absorbing blows and had decided to throw one. The barn fire had been meant to reduce him, to knock him back far enough that surrender became the easier path. Instead, it had apparently done something else. Crow had been in the territory long enough to know that some men broke under pressure and some men consolidated. He'd encountered the second type before. It was never a pleasant situation. He picked up his fork and finished his dinner with the careful appetite of a man who doesn't let inconvenience affect his habits, and he thought about what came next. The thing about being the most powerful man in a county for 20 years was that you accumulated instruments, people who owed you things, people who depended on arrangements you'd made possible, people who had made choices they'd prefer stayed quiet, and who stayed loyal primarily because you were the one who knew about those choices. He had been using those instruments at range. He had been surgical and careful. The problem was that surgical and careful had produced a barn fire and a wedding. He drank his wine and thought. The question now was not how to hurt Gideon Cross. That had been tried. The question was whether there was something in the legal structure of the situation, the land challenge, the existing debts and arrangements, that could be used to render the marriage itself into a liability. If Mabel's history, the Harlow debt, could be connected to Cross's property holdings in a way that complicated his standing with the county land office. He was still thinking about it when his foreman came in from the back with a look on his face that indicated the evening was not going to stay quiet. "We may have a problem," the foreman said. "What kind?" "The men who did the barn." A pause. "One of them has been talking." Crow set down his wine very carefully. "How much talking?" he said. "Enough." The foreman's voice was low. He said it to the wrong person, someone who doesn't— "Who?" the foreman told him. Crow sat with it. "Handle it," he said. "How?" "Quietly," Crow said, "and quickly." The foreman left. Crow sat alone at his dinner table and looked at the wall and felt, for the first time in a long time, the specific discomfort of a situation that was no longer entirely under his control. He didn't like it. What he didn't know, what he wouldn't find out until later, was that the person the barn man had talked to had already talked to someone else, and that someone else had, after considerable internal debate of the kind that keeps a person awake at 2 in the morning, decided that they were tired. Tired of being afraid. Tired of the weight of knowing things and staying quiet about them. The word was already moving through Red Hollow before Crow's foreman had finished his second glass of whiskey that night, moving through the same invisible channels that everything moved through in that town, finding the people it needed to find. And at the Cross Ranch, 7 miles out past the second ridge, the family that Bartholomew Crow had tried to scatter was sitting around the table in the lamplight, all 5 of them, the man who had stopped living among ghosts, and the woman who had refused to stay where she'd been put, and 3 girls who were learning what it meant to have ground under their feet. And whatever was coming, they were going to meet it from the same direction. Together. The man who had been talking was named Del Sutter, and he was 26 years old and not particularly bright, and had made a series of decisions over the previous 8 months that had seemed individually small and had accumulated into something he couldn't sleep with anymore. He hadn't set the fire himself. He'd been one of 3 men who'd ridden out to the Cross Ranch on that February night, and his job had been to hold the horses at the tree line while the other 2 went in with the torches. And he told himself beforehand that holding horses wasn't really doing anything, which was the kind of logic that works until it doesn't. The sound of the fire had been worse than he'd expected. The horses screaming in the barn had been worse than anything he'd expected. He'd ridden back to town in the dark and gone to bed and lain there listening to his own breathing and understood that holding the horses was, in fact, doing something. He told it to his cousin Roy because Roy was the person he told things to, and Roy was not part of Crow's circle and had no reason to stay quiet. And Roy had told his neighbor Ed Ferris, who ran the small freight operation on the South Road and who had his own history with Bartholomew Crow, a history involving a contract dispute that Crow had won through methods Ed had never been able to prove were wrong but had always known were. Ed Ferris was 53 years old and had been tired for a long time. He was the one who came to the Cross Ranch on the Saturday morning after the wedding, driving up the road in his freight wagon with the look of a man who has made a decision and is past the point of reconsidering it. Mabel was in the yard when he arrived. Gideon came out of the burned foundation. They'd been assessing what could be salvaged from the ruins, and the 3 of them stood in the winter yard and Ed Ferris told them what he knew. He told it plainly, without embellishment, the way a man tells something he's been rehearsing. When he was done, Mabel and Gideon were quiet for a moment. "Can Sutter be convinced to say this to someone official?" Gideon asked. "Maybe. He's scared." Ed looked at his hands on the wagon reins. "He's more scared of what Crow will do if he says it officially than what'll happen if he doesn't. Right now he's just leaking, telling his cousin. That's different from standing in front of a county sheriff. What would change that calculation for him? If he thought Crow was going down regardless. If he thought getting ahead of it was better than being caught in it." Ed looked at Gideon, and if somebody guaranteed he wouldn't end up the only one hanging for it while the men above him walked. Mabel had been thinking while they talked, and now she said, "Sutter isn't the only piece. The arson is one thing, but Crow's been operating for 20 years. There are other things." Ed looked at her. "The land deals," she said. "The Harlow note wasn't the only one of its kind. I know 2 other families who lost property to the same chain of legal transactions in the last 5 years, and the notes on all of them went through Crow's office before they got to the bank." She looked at Ed. "Were there others?" Ed was quiet for a long moment. "The Prestons," he said finally, "lost their south quarter to a tax sale 2 years back." Crow held the secondary note. "And the Teller homestead before that." He paused. "And there's the water rights on the North Creek. Crow filed the registration on those rights 6 years ago, filed them on a parcel he didn't own at the time." "How do you know that?" Gideon said. "Because I carried the survey equipment for the man who did the original survey," Ed said. "And the survey said one thing and the filing said something different. And when I mentioned it to the surveyor, he told me to forget I'd seen it and wouldn't discuss it again." His jaw tightened. "I've been carrying that for 6 years." The 3 of them stood in the cold February air with the ruins of the barn behind them and the weight of what had just been laid on the table between them. "Ed," Mabel said, "will you help us?" He looked at her. She held his gaze direct and calm, the way she held most things. "That's why I came," he said. What followed was not swift, and it was not clean, and it bore no resemblance to the version of justice that exists in stories where the right people say the right things at the right moment and everything falls into place. It was slow, and it was frustrating, and it involved a great deal of sitting in cold rooms talking to people who were not sure they were willing to help, and a great deal of being told to come back later, and a great deal of paperwork. Mabel drove that part of it. This surprised people, including somewhat Gideon, though in retrospect he thought it shouldn't have. She had a quality he'd identified early and continued to underestimate: the ability to sit across from a person who was reluctant or afraid and make them feel, without pressure and without false promise, that telling the truth was something they were already going to do and just needed a little company in deciding. She didn't argue. She didn't threaten. She listened to people's hesitations as if they were legitimate, because they were, and she acknowledged the cost of what she was asking, because it was real, and she sat with them in the reality of that cost until they came to their own conclusion. It was, Gideon thought, probably the most dangerous thing about her. The attorney Ames was their first formal stop. He had been running the response to the land challenge and had a working knowledge of Crow's legal methods that, combined with what Ed Ferris had provided about the water rights filing, gave him something real to work with. If the survey discrepancy is documented, Ames said, leaning over his desk with his glasses pushed up on his forehead, and if we can get the original surveyor on record, which I understand is uncertain, then we have a filing fraud. That's not just a civil matter, that's criminal. The surveyor is in Tulsa now, Ed said. He'd come along sitting in the corner of Ames's office with his hat in his lap. I don't know if he'll talk. Can you reach him? I can try. Try, Ames said. The water rights fraud was the cleanest piece because it was on paper. The discrepancy between the survey and the filing existed in documents, in the county record, and what had protected Crow for 6 years was that nobody had put those two documents side by side and noted the difference. Ames spent an afternoon in the county records office doing exactly that, and came out looking like a man who has found what he went looking for. It's there, he told Gideon and Mabel that evening. Plain as anything, once you know to look. Why hasn't anyone looked before? Mabel asked. Ames was quiet for a moment. Because people who might have looked had reasons not to, he said. Crow keeps a long list of people with reasons not to look at things carefully. Does he have anything on you? Mabel asked directly. Ames looked at her. She met his eyes and waited. No, he said, which is probably why Cross came to me instead of someone else. Yes, Gideon said. The harder work was the people. Legal documents were one thing. The county sheriff, a man named Aldred who had been elected twice with Crow's visible support, was going to need more than documents. He was going to need witnesses, and witnesses meant people. And people in Red Hollow had 20 years of very good reasons to stay quiet about Bartholomew Crow. Mabel started with the women. This was not strategy exactly, or not only strategy. It was also the recognition that the social machinery Crow had been using against her ran through the same channels she now needed to run something else through. The women of Red Hollow knew things. They knew because women in small towns always know the most, occupying as they do the spaces, the stores, the social gatherings, the kitchens where business is discussed within earshot, where information moves. She went first to the milliner, Margaret Holst, who had nodded at her in the hotel on the morning of the wedding. Margaret was 60 years old and had been in Red Hollow since before Crow arrived and had watched everything since with the clear-eyed detachment of someone who has seen several versions of the same story and knows how they tend to end. They sat in the back room of the millinery with coffee going cold between them, and Mabel told her what she knew and what she needed, and Margaret listened without interrupting. When Mabel finished, Margaret was quiet for a moment. The Teller homestead, she said. Alice Teller's still in town. Works at the hotel now. She has documents. I know she kept documents from that transaction because she told me at the time she didn't understand them, and I didn't either, but she kept them. Would she talk to me? Margaret looked at her with the measured assessment of a woman who has been evaluating other women all her life. Come back tomorrow, she said. I'll have Alice here. Alice Teller was 42 and had the face of someone who had been disappointed so thoroughly and so thoroughly absorbed it that the disappointment had become just part of her expression. She was not hostile to Mabel. She was careful, the way people are careful when they have been burned by the thing they're being asked to touch again. She brought the documents. They were a stack of papers tied with twine, somewhat crumpled, some of them water-stained, and they showed, in the technical language of legal transactions, a sequence that Ames later characterized as a predatory debt structure, the kind of arrangement that is legal in its individual steps and designed to produce a specific outcome in its accumulated effect. I knew something was wrong, Alice said, looking at the papers on Margaret's table. I didn't know how to say what was wrong. It was all legal. Every time I asked, they showed me the paper that said it was legal. I know, Mabel said. My husband thought I was he thought I didn't understand. He trusted Crow. She stopped. Crow was at the funeral. He shook my hand. Mabel sat with this. Would you be willing to tell what you know to the county investigator? She asked. With the documents? Alice looked at the papers. Her jaw worked. Will it matter? I think it might. I think it will matter more if you're not the only one. Who else is there? I'm still finding out, Mabel said. The word that moved through Red Hollow after the barn fire was different from the word that had moved before it. Before, the information moving through the town had been Crow's information, about Mabel's character, about Gideon's legal troubles, about the inadvisability of extending credit or social goodwill to the Cross Ranch. It had moved through the channels Crow controlled, and it had served his purposes. The fire changed the texture of it, because Red Hollow was a town that had burned before, a warehouse fire 15 years back, a house fire before that, and the people who lived there had the bone-deep collective memory of what fire did to a community, and the rumor that the cross barn had been set was not rumor in a comfortable way. It was the kind of information that made people look at their own structures, their own barns and houses, and think about who in their community might make a decision like that, and whether they were comfortable with what that implied. Frank Halston, who ran the livery and had done quiet business with Gideon for years, came to the ranch on a Tuesday. He came alone, and he was nervous, and he spent the first 10 minutes talking about nothing in particular before Gideon, who had been waiting him out, said, "Frank, what did you come to say?" Frank turned his hat in his hands. "Crow called in my note last month. I didn't know you had a note with him. Most people do, and most people don't talk about it." He looked at the hat. When he called it in, he said, "He didn't say what he'd do if I didn't cooperate. He didn't have to. I have 3 kids and a livery and a note that's due in 60 days. What does he want from you?" He wanted me to say, if anyone asked, that I'd heard you had trouble with the law back east before you came here, that there was something in your history. Gideon was very still. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd think about it." Frank finally looked up. "I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks. I came here instead." The kitchen was quiet. Mabel was at the stove, her back to them, but her hands had gone still on what she was doing. "I don't have any trouble in my history back east," Gideon said. "I know that. I don't know that, but I know Crow. And I know what that request looks like." Frank's voice was tight. "He's building something to use against you if the legal stuff doesn't work. I think he's going to try to get you removed from your own property on some manufactured—" "Frank," Gideon's voice was calm, but it stopped him. "How many other men do you think he's asked to do something similar?" Frank thought about it. "At least 3. Maybe more. Would those men talk to my attorney if they knew others were talking?" A long pause. "Maybe. If they thought it was real. If they thought it was actually going somewhere, not just—" He stopped. "Most people have tried not causing trouble with Crow for a long time, and they're not going to change that for something that might just blow over." "It's not going to blow over," Mabel said. Both men looked at her. She'd turned from the stove. "This has been coming for a long time," she said. "He burned a barn and it didn't work. He's tried to cut off our supplies, our credit, our labor, and none of it worked. He's running out of tools that are halfway subtle, which means what comes next won't be subtle at all. And everyone in this county who he's got notes on and arrangements with needs to understand that being associated with what comes next is not a position they want to be in." Frank looked at her. "He's going down," she said. "Not because we're stronger than him, because he's been taking from people for 20 years, and now the people he's been taking from have somewhere to put it. That's the thing about this kind of man. He spends so long believing fear is permanent that he doesn't notice when it turns." Frank was quiet for a moment. 3 men, he said finally. "I can get you 3 names." "That's a start," Mabel said. The investigator came from the county seat in early March, sent by the district attorney's office on the basis of a formal complaint that Ames had filed with the filing fraud documentation attached. His name was Carver, and he was a dry, efficient man in his 40s who gave the impression of having seen most things and found them less surprising than other people did. He set up in the magistrate's back office for a week, and during that week he spoke to 11 people. Not all of them had come willingly. Some had come because Mabel had spent the previous 3 weeks in conversations that ranged from straightforward to exhausting, sitting with people's fear and waiting for it to move. Some had come because Ed Ferris had a particular credibility in that county, having been around long enough and been wronged visibly enough that his word carried weight. Some had come because Frank Halston had made 3 phone calls, and the men he'd called had made their own calculations and arrived at the same place. Del Sutter came on the 4th day, escorted by his cousin Roy, and told investigator Carver everything he knew about the night of February 11th in exchange for a written agreement about his own exposure that Ames had negotiated. He was not a sympathetic figure. He knew it. He sat in the magistrate's back room with his hat between his knees and his face the color of old chalk, and said what he'd done and what he'd seen. And it was not a comfortable thing to watch, and it was necessary. The surveyor came from Tulsa on the 6th day. Ed had reached him, and the conversation Ed had described as uncertain had apparently gone differently than expected, because the man arrived with his original field notes still in a leather case that had been sitting in his study for 6 years. And he told Carver what those notes showed and what the file document had changed, and his voice was steady throughout. The voice of a man who has been holding something for too long and is relieved to put it down. Gideon and Mabel were not in the room for most of this. They were not allowed to be. Carver was careful about the integrity of the process and had made it clear from the start that he was conducting his investigation independently and that he would not have the complainants present during witness interviews. They waited. This was harder for Mabel than she'd expected because she was not naturally a person who could wait when things were happening, and the week that Carver spent in the magistrate's back office was one of the longer weeks of her life. She cleaned the house. She worked the garden, which was starting to consider spring. She repaired 3 things that had been waiting for repair. She had a long conversation with Clara about what was happening that was the most honest conversation she'd had with her daughter about anything since Thomas died. And Clara listened and asked 2 questions and at the end said, "I think it's going to work," with the particular confidence of someone who has been watching carefully for months and has formed a considered opinion. "I hope you're right," Mabel said. "I usually am," Clara said, which was not modest but was accurate. Crow heard about the investigator within an hour of his arrival, which was not surprising. What was surprising to him, or not surprising exactly, but unsettling in the specific way that certainty unsettles when it's the wrong kind, was the list of people going in and out of that back office. He'd known about Ed Ferris. He'd expected Ed Ferris. He'd underestimated Ed Ferris's connections, which was a mistake he recognized only in retrospect. He had not expected Alice Teller. He'd considered Alice Teller a resolved matter. He had not expected Frank Halston, whom he'd believed was secured. He definitely had not expected the surveyor. He sat in his office on the evening of the 6th day and did what he'd always done when situations needed managing. He assessed, methodically, what instruments remained available to him and how they might be applied. The list was shorter than it had been a month ago. The water rights fraud was documented and witnessed. The arson was witnessed. The debt manipulation was documented in Alice Teller's papers, which Ames now had. What he had left was what he'd always had: his standing in this community, his relationships, his reach. And he had the specific advantage of a man who had operated in a place for 20 years and knew where every body was buried, metaphorically speaking. He decided to go talk to Gideon Cross directly. This was, he would later understand, the decision that sealed it. But he made it with the logic that had always served him, that a direct conversation, man to man, before things became irreversible, was the kind of thing that men of stature did. That Gideon Cross was a practical person who could be made to see the practical reality of the situation. That there was still perhaps a version of this where both men walked away with something. He came to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon. He came alone, which was either confidence or miscalculation, and he drove his own buggy rather than sending a man first, which meant he decided the directness of the gesture was worth something. Mabel was in the garden when she heard the buggy, and she came around the side of the house and saw who it was and went inside without running, which cost her something, and got Gideon from the barn. They both came out to meet him. Crow looked at them standing together in the yard. The tall man with the scar on his jaw and the woman beside him, and behind her at the window, briefly, the face of the oldest girl. And he had a moment of seeing it as it actually was, rather than as a configuration of problems. And the moment passed, and he was back to business. "Gideon," he said, stepping down from the buggy. "Mabel." The use of her first name was deliberate, and they both knew it. "I thought it was time we talked." "About what?" Gideon said. "About this situation that's gotten unnecessarily complicated." He had his reasonable voice on. the voice he used when he was explaining things to people who he needed to believe he was being reasonable. There are documents in front of a county investigator right now that represent a particular interpretation of business decisions made over many years. I want you to understand that there are other interpretations. I'm sure there are, Gideon said. I also want you to understand that a process like this, an investigation, whatever follows, is damaging to a community, to relationships that people have depended on. I have arrangements with 60 families in this county, arrangements that function because there's stability. If those arrangements are disrupted, those arrangements will survive without you, Mabel said. Crow looked at her. Something in his expression adjusted, the reasonable warmth thinning slightly. You've been very determined, Mrs. Cross. I respect determination, but I want you to think carefully about what you're unleashing. You've been here, 6 months? You don't know the history of this county the way— I know enough, she said. You know what people have chosen to tell you, which is a specific selection. He shifted his attention back to Gideon. I came to offer a resolution. The land challenge is dropped. Immediately. I'll make arrangements for the reconstruction of your barn. A goodwill gesture, call it what you want, and I will leave you alone. All of you. That's the offer. Gideon looked at him. And in return, he said, in return, whatever has been told to that investigator is revised. People misremember. Documents get recontextualized. It happens all the time. The yard was quiet. A bird somewhere in the trees by the east fence. The sound of the horses in the temporary paddock they'd set up after the barn. You burned my barn, Gideon said. His voice was very level. You took this woman's home through a fraudulent debt chain. You falsified a water rights filing. You threatened my suppliers, my credit, and my employees. You sent a man to my wife's door. He paused. And you're standing in my yard offering me a deal. I'm offering you a practical resolution, Crow said. The alternative is a long, expensive, uncertain process that damages everyone involved. You should leave, Gideon said. Crow looked at him, then at Mabel, then back. You're making a mistake, he said. Then it's mine to make, Gideon said. Crow stood there for one more moment, and then something happened that neither Mabel nor Gideon had fully anticipated. Crow's composure, which had been a constant in every interaction, slipped. Not dramatically, not into visible rage, but just the warmth went out of it entirely, and what was underneath was something colder and less managed than anything he'd shown before. I built this county, he said. His voice was quiet, and it was different from all his previous voices. Everything here, the roads, the credit lines, the arrangements that let people survive hard winters, that's mine. And you think a widow and a hermit and some frightened people with old paperwork are going to undo 20 years of— Tom Rafferty's at the feed store right now, Mabel said. Crow stopped. He came to see us yesterday, she said. He wanted us to know that he'd been told to pull our credit. He also wanted us to know he was extending it again, regardless. She held Crow's gaze. Frank Halston, Ed Ferris, Margaret Holst, Alice Teller, the surveyor from Tulsa. She said each name clearly, the way you set down weights. These are people you believed you owned. You don't own people. You just convinced them for a while that you did. Crow looked at her for a long moment. Then he got back in his buggy and drove away. Neither Mabel nor Gideon moved until the buggy was past the first bend in the road. Then Mabel let out a breath that she'd been holding for approximately the last 5 minutes. He threatened the investigation, Gideon said. He threatened it in front of both of us, she said. Who just heard everything he said? Gideon looked at her. We need to tell Ames tonight, she said. Yes, he said. We do. They went inside and Mabel wrote while Gideon dictated, and Clara sat at the table with them because she was old enough to know what was happening, and Mabel had decided she was old enough to be part of it, and the lamp burned late, and outside the night was cold and clear, and the ridge stood dark against the stars, and 7 miles away in the town of Red Hollow, Bartholomew Crow sat in his house and felt, for the first time, the specific sensation of a foundation that has been quietly giving way for months, finally admitting what it's been doing. Ames delivered the written account of Crow's yard visit to Investigator Carver on a Friday morning, and Carver read it twice without changing expression, which was apparently what he did with everything, and then he looked up and said, He said this in front of both of them. Both of them, Ames confirmed. Carver set the document down. That's not a careful man anymore. No, Ames said. It isn't. What neither of them said, but both understood, was that 20 years of operating without consequence had done something to Bartholomew Crow's judgment, had worn away the caution that careful men maintain when they know they can be held accountable, because he had for so long existed in a condition where accountability was theoretical. He'd looked at Gideon and Mabel in that yard and seen two people he'd been trying to move for months, and something in him had stopped calculating and started talking. And the talking had produced a witness statement that was worth more than most of what was already in Carver's file. The formal charges came down in the third week of March. There were 5 of them: filing fraud on the water rights registration, arson by proxy, criminal conspiracy in the debt manipulation scheme, affecting the Teller and Preston properties, witness intimidation, and attempted obstruction of a county investigation. The last one was the yard visit, and it was the one that Crow's attorney immediately tried to have dismissed on the grounds that it was two people's account of a private conversation, and the attempt failed because Ames had anticipated it and had made sure that Clara, who had been sitting at the table inside with the window open, had heard every word and was prepared to say so. And an 11-year-old girl's clear, unembellished account of what she'd heard carried a weight that was difficult to argue with. Crow was not arrested immediately. He was served with the charges and released pending proceedings, which was the way things worked for men of his standing, and which produced a period of approximately 3 weeks, during which he was technically free and practically a diminished thing, walking through the town he'd built as though testing whether it still held his weight. It didn't. The mechanism of it was not dramatic. It was the small daily withdrawal of the deference that powerful men depend on. The slight pause before people greeted him that hadn't been there before. The conversations that didn't start when he entered a room, the look in Tom Rafferty's eyes at the feed store that was not hostile but was not what it had been, and both of them knew the difference. The people who had stayed inside for 20 years because the cost of standing outside was too high were still mostly inside, but they had moved to the windows, and Crow could see them there, and that was its own kind of verdict. His attorney was good and expensive and managed to negotiate the terms of what followed, so that what Crow ultimately faced was not everything that might have been possible, but was enough. The water rights fraud produced a criminal conviction and a fine substantial enough to require the liquidation of several properties to satisfy. The arson conspiracy produced a sentence, reduced by his attorney's work and his own lack of direct personal presence at the fire, to something that would nonetheless change the shape of his life permanently. The debt manipulation charges produced civil liability that, combined with the criminal penalties, effectively dismantled the financial structure he'd spent 20 years assembling. Del Sutter served 6 months and left Red Hollow immediately after, and nobody missed him particularly. The 2 men who had actually set the fire served more, and they were not from Red Hollow originally and were not mourned. Crow's house was sold in June to pay the civil judgments. He moved to the county seat to live with a sister nobody in Red Hollow had known about, and he was 62 years old and not a poor man in the absolute sense, but a diminished one, and he never came back to Red Hollow, and the town, after a period of adjustment, found that it did not miss him either. What it missed was the certainty of his arrangements, the credit lines, the supply agreements, the machinery of dependency that had been real even while it was exploitative. And the period after his removal was not easy for everyone, because freedom from a bad arrangement still requires you to build a new one, and building is harder than being managed. But that work began, and it was honest work, and honesty in the foundation makes a difference over time. The barn went up in April. This was not a metaphor. It was a literal barn, built on the original stone foundation that had survived the fire, and it went up over the course of 3 weekends in April and early May. And the people who came to build it were not all people Gideon would have predicted. Frank Halston came and brought 2 of his workers. Ed Ferris came and brought lumber on his freight wagon that he'd sourced at a fair price from a supplier 2 counties over, bypassing the usual chain that had run through Crow's influence. Tom Rafferty came on the second weekend with his 2 grown sons, both of whom worked without speaking much but worked hard and knew what they were doing. A man named Garrett, the sheep farmer who had come to warn Gideon in December with his hat brim angled low and his conscience uncomfortable, came on the first day and didn't leave until dark. And he and Gideon worked alongside each other without discussing what had passed between them, because they were both men who settled accounts through action rather than conversation. Mabel fed all of them. This was not a small thing. 20-plus people over 3 weekends required planning and execution on a scale that would have tested a proper kitchen with a full staff, and she did it with Clara beside her and June occasionally conscripted from the paddock when numbers required. And the food was not fancy, but it was substantial and well-made, and it was given without the quality of charity, which mattered. People could tell the difference between being fed as an act of obligation and being fed by someone who believed that feeding people was worth doing well. Margaret Holst came on the second weekend, not to build but to bring pies and to sit with Mabel for an hour in the afternoon when the building noise was loud enough to cover conversation. And they talked, really talked, the way women talk when they've decided to stop being careful with each other. About the town, about what had happened and what came next, about what Red Hollow might be if the infrastructure Crow had built was replaced with something that didn't have his fingerprints on it. The bank is the problem, Margaret said. Not the bank itself, but who it listens to now that Crow's gone. It's going to revert to the safest behavior it knows, which is doing nothing for anyone it doesn't already know. Can that change? Margaret looked at her over her coffee. It changes if the right people make it clear they expect it to change, and if those people have standing. She paused. You have standing now, whether you want it or not. Mabel received this. She was not someone who had sought standing. She was someone who had sought to survive, and then, finding survival possible, had sought to push further, and she had not been thinking about what any of it would look like from outside. I don't know what to do with standing, she said honestly. Yes, you do, Margaret said. You've been doing it for months. You just haven't called it that. Though the barn was finished on a Saturday in the second week of May, and someone, nobody took credit for it, had put up a long table in the yard with benches on both sides. And the day ended with supper outside in the spring evening with the new structure behind them, its raw lumber pale against the old stone foundation. Not beautiful yet, but solid. The solid that comes from being built right rather than quickly. Ada sat at the end of the table between June and a boy about her age whose name was Sam, and whose father had come to build, and she talked to Sam with the complete confidence of someone who has never considered that another person might not want to be talked to. And Sam, who was quieter, turned out to be a reasonable audience for Ada Cross. June had been largely unreachable for the day, occupied in the paddock with the bay mare and the additional 2 horses that Gideon had acquired in March when the operation began to recover. But she appeared at supper and ate with the appetite of someone who had been doing physical work and was happy, which was the expression June most naturally wore when she was near animals, and also increasingly when she was simply home. Clara sat beside Mabel and watched everything with her usual comprehensive attention, and at one point Mabel looked over at her and said quietly, "What are you thinking?" Clara considered this. "I'm thinking it's different," she said. "From what?" "From the way things were before, when it was just us." She looked down the table. "I'm thinking I didn't know it was supposed to feel like this. The having people." Mabel looked at her daughter. This child who had sat on auction steps with her jaw set and her father's red hair and her mother's refusal to look away, and felt the specific ache of a parent who loves someone enough to wish they could have given them more sooner, combined with the specific gratitude of a parent who watches their child find their footing. "No," she said. "Neither did I." "Mama." "Yes." Clara looked at her with the directness she'd always had. "Are you happy now?" Mabel thought about the question her daughter had asked her 6 months ago on the porch steps, and what she'd answered then, that she was becoming something, that happy wasn't quite the right word for it, and she looked down the table at Gideon, who was in the middle of what appeared to be a technical disagreement with Ed Ferris about lumber grades, and who would not have described the conversation as an expression of contentment, but whose face, in the middle of this argument with someone he'd come to consider a friend, was easier than she had ever seen it in the first weeks of knowing him. "Yes," she said, "I think I actually am." Clara nodded and leaned her shoulder against her mother's arm, the way she had on the porch that fall evening. And for a few minutes they just sat together in the spring dark while the table made noise around them. Gideon found Mabel after supper sitting on the porch steps, the same steps where so many things had been decided or discovered over the previous months, while the last of the guests were making their way to their wagons, and the sound of the evening was settling back in around the departure of all those people. He sat beside her. They were both tired. It was the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from a day of real work that produced something real, but it was thorough and it sat in the bones, and they didn't try to talk over it. After a while, Gideon said, "The east paddock fence needs another 2 posts before the summer." "I know," she said. "I saw. I thought maybe Saturday." "I can help Saturday." A pause. "I know you can." The yard was empty now, the table still standing with its leftover debris of a good meal, the new barn pale in the last light. The mountains were dark against a sky still holding some color from the sunset. "Gideon?" "Yes." She looked at him. At the scar on his jaw and the gray in his hair and the lines in his face that were the record of years spent mostly alone, outside, against weather. At the man who had bought her dignity for $10 and hadn't once since acted like she owed him anything for it. "Do you know what I thought about most?" she said. "In those months before the auction, when things were at their worst." He waited. "I thought about whether it was possible for a person's life to be completely over before they were dead," she said. "Whether you could run out of road and still be breathing." She looked at the barn. "I thought mine was over. I thought I'd used up everything, every option, every resource, every favor I had any right to ask for, and what was left was damage management, getting the girls through, nothing for myself. Not anymore." He didn't say anything, which was right. "I'm telling you that because I want you to know the distance," she said, "between where I was and where I am. So you understand that it's not that things are fine now. Things are hard. The money is still tight, and there's a lot of work, and I don't know what the bank is going to do, and there are people in that town who will always think of me as the woman from the auction." She paused. "But I know what I'm standing on now. That's the thing that changed. I know the ground is real." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. "You did that," he said. "The ground being real. You did most of that." "We did it. I gave you a place to stand," he said. "What you built on it was yours." She shook her head slightly. "You went into a burning barn for the horses. The horses needed—" "You went into a burning barn," she said, "and then you stood in the ash and asked me to stay." She looked at him steadily. "That's not nothing, Gideon. That's not nothing to me." He was quiet. The sky had gone to dark blue, and the first stars were out. "I wasn't sure you'd say yes," he said. "When I asked, I know you weren't. Were you sure?" She thought about it honestly because he deserved the honest answer. "I was sure by the time you finished asking," she said, which is probably as sure as most people get about anything that matters. He nodded. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me. When she died, my wife, I thought the thing I'd lost was the future, the version of the future we'd planned together." He stopped. He didn't talk about this often. Mabel knew and stayed still, giving it room. "I spent 8 years thinking the future was just a thing I'd had once and used up, that what was left was the work and the land, and that was appropriate, and that was enough." "Was it enough?" "It was sufficient," he said. "Sufficient is different from enough." He looked at the new barn. "What I found out this year is that I was wrong about the future. I wasn't understanding it correctly. It's not a thing you have and use up. It's a thing that keeps arriving, whether you're ready for it or not." Mabel sat with this. "Ada is going to wake us up very early tomorrow," she said. He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him in all the months she'd known him, and it was small and it was real. "She wakes everyone up early every day." "She got that from me," Mabel said. "I was a very early waker as a child. My mother found it exhausting." "I find it—" He stopped. "What?" "I find it fine," he said. She knew what it was that he'd stopped himself from saying, and she knew why he'd stopped, and she valued both the almost saying and the stopping because they were both true to who he was. He wasn't a man for declarations. He was a man for gate hinges and burning barns and $10 at an auction where nobody else would bid, and she had learned that these were their own language, and she was becoming fluent in it. They sat on the steps until Ada appeared at the door, wanting to know when it was bedtime, and the question of bedtime required both of them, and they went inside. Summer came to the Cross Ranch the way summer came to that country, wide and direct and without apology, the sky enormous above the ridge, the grass in the lower pastures going from green to gold in the long days of June. The cattle operation began to recover in the way that recovering things do, Not all at once, but in increments that you could measure if you were paying attention. And Gideon was always paying attention. Mabel planted a proper garden, the first real planting since she'd arrived, and found it in ruins. She did it in the early mornings when the light was still cool, before the heat came up, and June helped with a focused competence that had grown over the winter and spring into something genuinely useful, and Ada mostly helped by handing things to people and talking. But she talked helpfully, mostly, and her presence in the garden had a quality of good chaos that Mabel had decided was worth tolerating. Clara started riding that summer. This happened because June taught her, which happened because June had been given the responsibility of the two younger horses and had determined that Clara needed to know how to ride properly, which was not a request she'd made so much as a campaign she'd conducted until Clara agreed. The bay mare was not involved. That was June's animal, and June's alone. But the smaller brown gelding proved a patient teacher for a girl who was athletic enough and analytical enough to understand what she was being asked to do and do it without the fear that makes the first stages of riding difficult. Gideon watched Clara's first real ride from the fence, not saying anything, and afterward Clara came over and said, "June says my form is acceptable." "High praise from June," he said. Clara nodded. She sat with this for a moment. "Did you teach your wife to ride?" The question was in the direct tradition of all Clara's questions. Unguarded, genuinely curious, no awareness of the territory it was entering. He'd learned to receive them that way. "She already knew when I met her," he said. "She was a better rider than me." Clara absorbed this with interest. What was she like? He thought about it. "Stubborn," he said, "particular about how things should be done, not patient with people who she thought were wasting her time." He paused. "She would have liked your mother." Clara looked at him. "And she would have found Ada absolutely exhausting," he said. Clara laughed. It was a real laugh, unexpected, and it surprised them both. And the sound of it carried across the paddock, where June was putting the bay mare through her paces, and June looked over with an expression of mild curiosity before returning to her work. What Mabel thought about, in the months that followed, the summer and into the next fall, watching the ranch find its feet again, watching her daughters grow into the shape of girls who knew where they lived and intended to stay there, was how much of what had happened was about visibility, not fame, not recognition in the public sense, though some of that had come, the quiet kind that accumulates when a community watches something true happen in its midst and decides to remember it. She meant something simpler and more fundamental, the difference between being seen and not being seen. Between being treated as a person whose presence in a situation was relevant, whose experience had weight, whose existence counted in the accounting, and being treated as a problem to be managed, a cost to be minimized, a woman whose value was entirely instrumental and could be assessed at a labor auction for $10. She had been the second thing her whole life and had not, until it changed, fully understood what it was costing her. What it costs anyone to be that. The particular exhaustion of moving through the world as something less than you are. She thought about Alice Teller, who had sat in Margaret Holt's back room with her stack of papers and said, "I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how to say what was wrong." That was not stupidity. That was what happens to people who have been told for long enough that their perception of wrong is not reliable, that the documents are correct, that the process is legal, that their discomfort is their problem. Eventually, you stop trusting your own reading of a room. She thought about Del Sutter, who had held the horses at the tree line and told himself it wasn't really doing anything. There was something instructive in that too, and not entirely comfortable, because she understood the mechanism, the small moral erosions that happen when you attach yourself to power and let its logic become your logic. It was not a story about a villain holding horses. It was a story about a person who made a series of choices that each seemed individually manageable and collectively amounted to something he couldn't sleep with. She didn't forgive him. Forgiving was different from understanding, but she understood the machinery of it, and understanding the machinery was useful. What she had come to believe through the specific education of this particular year was that communities are not held together by the powerful people who believe they are holding them together. They are held together by the ordinary people who show up, who carry lumber, who come forward with papers they've kept in a drawer for 6 years, who tell their cousin what they can't sleep with, Who drive a freight wagon 4 miles to a ranch where someone is trying to tell the truth and decide to help? Crow had believed genuinely that he had built Red Hollow, and he had built things, structures, arrangements, dependencies. But they were not the town. They were scaffolding he'd erected over the town and mistaken for its bones. When the scaffolding came down, the bones were still there. The people, the relationships between them, the ordinary human desire to live in a place where things are fair, approximately, and where burning someone's barn because they won't do what you tell them is not acceptable. That desire was always there. It just needed somewhere to go. In September, almost a year to the month from the labor auction in Red Hollow Square, Mabel Cross drove into town alone for the first time in weeks. For the straightforward purpose of purchasing supplies and mailing a letter she'd written to a distant cousin she hadn't been in contact with since before Thomas died. She parked the wagon outside Rafferty's and went in, and Tom Rafferty greeted her by name and pulled her usual order before she'd finished asking for it, and they talked briefly about the summer's feed prices in the easy manner of two people who have a working relationship that functions, and she paid and thanked him and left. At the dry goods store, the woman behind the counter, not the owner, but a girl who'd started working there in the spring, smiled when she came in. A real smile, not the careful kind. "Mrs. Cross," she said, "the cotton you ordered came in." "Thank you, Ellen." On her way back to the wagon, she passed Margaret Holst's millinery, and Margaret was in the window and waved, and Mabel waved back. None of these were large things. She was not unaware of that. There were still people in Red Hollow who had crossed to the other side of the street before talking to her, who held the story of the auction as evidence of something permanent about her, who would not revise their assessment of what she was regardless of what she did. Those people existed and would continue to exist, and she had made a practical peace with them, the peace of someone who has decided not to need the approval of people who withhold it as a method of control. But the small things accumulated. A town does not transform suddenly. It shifts, slowly, under the weight of what its people decide to tolerate and what they decide they won't. And the decision is never unanimous and is never final, and the next generation inherits the shift as their baseline and starts from there. It is not satisfying in the way that complete stories are satisfying, but it is how it actually works. And Mabel had come to value how things actually work over how they look in the telling. She drove back along the road toward the ridge in the September afternoon. The light coming in at the long angle it got at that time of year, gold and specific, laying everything out in the clearest possible version of itself. She'd been thinking for a few weeks now about the thing Gideon had said on the porch the night the barn was finished, about the future not being something you have and use up, but something that keeps arriving. She had rolled it over and found it to be, in her considered estimation, true. She had arrived at 34 years old believing her life was over, and the belief had been so thorough that she'd packed her daughters and her mismatched boots and her $10 dignity into a wagon and left town with a stranger without expecting anything from it except survival. What she'd found instead was that the capacity for things to get better is more durable than you think it is when you're in the worst of it. That it survives being beaten up by circumstances and poverty and humiliation and loss and the specific cruelty of powerful men who mistake their power for a natural condition of the universe. That you can be auctioned off in a public square, and still, given some time and the right ground and someone who treats your presence as a fact rather than a favor, you can still build something real. She wasn't naive about it. The ranch was hard work and the money was tight, and Gideon was not a simple man to share a life with, and she was not a simple woman, and there were days when both of them were sharp with each other and had to work back from it. Clara was 12 now and heading toward the terrain of adolescence that Mabel remembered from her own experience as a place full of unexpected weather. Ada would not remain 5 forever, and the Ada of later years was going to be, Mabel thought, with a mixture of love and resignation, an absolute force of nature. None of it would be smooth. None of it would be easy in any permanent way. Life on a working ranch in difficult country with a complicated history and 4 people who all had their own ideas about things was not going to present itself as a long, uncomplicated stretch of peace. But she crested the ridge and the ranch came into view below her. The house, the new barn pale against the stone foundation, the paddock where June would already be with the horses, the garden that had produced better than expected this year. And she felt the thing she'd been trying to name for months settle into something clear. It was home. Not in the soft sense that word sometimes gets used, the sentimental version, in the hard sense. The sense that means, this is the place I have chosen and that has chosen me back. And I know what it costs and I am paying it willingly, and when something tries to take it, I will stand in front of it. And that is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. She drove down the slope toward the house, and Gideon was coming out of the barn when she pulled into the yard, and he walked over to help her down from the wagon, the way he'd started doing sometime in the spring without either of them commenting on it. And she handed him the reins, and he tied the horse, and then stood there for a moment. "Good trip?" he said. "Fine," she said. "Normal." "Good." She looked at him. At this man who had never been easy and had never promised anything he didn't deliver and had stood in a yard full of strangers with $10 and his word. "Gideon," she said. "Yes." "Thank you." He looked at her with the expression she'd learned to read as him taking something in completely, giving it its full weight. "Don't thank me," he said. I'm going to anyway." He looked at her for one more moment, and then from inside the house came the sound of Ada, who had apparently heard the wagon and was coming at full speed, her voice preceding her by several seconds, and they both turned toward the sound of her without needing to discuss it, and the afternoon moved into evening the way all their afternoons moved into evening now, with noise and work and the particular ordinary chaos of a full house on a working ranch, and the light went gold and then orange and then deep, and the ridge held the last of it for a while before the dark came, and the lamp went on in the kitchen window, and the cross ranch was lit from inside, and it had been for some time now, and it intended to stay that way.